Everybody talks about how Gojo lost, but almost nobody talks about what actually ruined his character. And no, it wasn't the death itself. Gojo dying was inevitable. The strongest character in Jujutsu Kaisen had to fall for the story to move forward. The real problem was what Gege made Gojo say after he died. Because in a single chapter, Gege didn't just try to elevate Sukuna. He accidentally rewrote who Gojo Satoru was as a person. Instead of a mentor, instead of a protector, instead of the man carrying the burden of an entire generation, Gojo suddenly started sounding like a battle addict who only cared about fighting someone stronger than himself. And the worst part, that interpretation completely contradicts the story Gege himself wrote. The afterlife sequence was clearly meant to accomplish one thing: convince the audience that Sukuna was unquestionably above Gojo. That's why Gege has Gojo say things like Sukuna was holding back, Sukuna may have won even without 10 shadows, he feels sorry for Sukuna because Sukuna couldn't go all out. But the more you actually think about these statements, the less they sound like Gojo talking, and the more they sound like Gege speaking through Gojo. Because Gojo has never viewed battle the same way Sukuna does. That distinction is extremely important. Sukuna fights because he enjoys destruction, because he's selfish, because he's a calamity. Gojo fights because he carries responsibility. Those are not the same thing. One of the strangest things Gege tried adding near the end of Jujutsu Kaisen was this idea that Sukuna represents loneliness, that deep down the strongest are isolated. But here's the issue: Sukuna himself never acts like someone searching for love. He doesn't crave companionship, he doesn't seek understanding, he doesn't desire emotional connection. In fact, Sukuna rejects all of those things constantly. He's perfectly content being a monster. That's why Gege originally describing Sukuna as a natural calamity works so well. A hurricane doesn't care if people love it. It simply destroys because destruction is its nature. That is Sukuna. Which is why using Gojo to suddenly project themes of loneliness and understanding onto Sukuna feels so forced. Those themes belong more naturally to Gojo than Sukuna, because Gojo actually did feel isolated. Gojo wanted equals, students, connection. Sukuna never cared about any of that. And this is where the afterlife scene truly damages Gojo's character, because the scene reframes Gojo as someone who ultimately just wanted a good fight. But that has never been who Gojo was. Yes, Gojo enjoys showing off. Yes, he loves his own strength. But every major fight in the series proves he fights for a reason beyond entertainment. Against Toji to protect Riko, against Jogo and Hanami protecting civilians, and against Sukuna, he specifically wanted to kill Sukuna because of what Sukuna did to Yuji. That is not the mindset of a battle maniac. Gojo's entire character revolves around responsibility, the burden of being the strongest. He isn't like Sukuna, and that's exactly why their clash worked in the first place. They were opposites, but the afterlife scene blurs that distinction so much that Gojo almost starts sounding like Kashimo, and that's simply not consistent with his character. Now let's talk about the biggest issue. The actual fight does not support Gojo's afterlife dialogue, because Gege tries to tell us Sukuna was holding back, but what we see tells a different story. Sukuna needed Makora's adaptation to bypass infinity. That was the entire point of the Ten Shadows strategy. Without adaptation, Sukuna had no reliable answer to infinity. And people say, well, Sukuna still had Fuga, his true form, extra arms, extra mouths. Okay, how does any of that bypass infinity? It doesn't. The world-cutting slash only became possible because Makora showed Sukuna a model for bypassing infinity. That matters. And this is where Gojo's statement starts falling apart. Because if Gojo avoids that final slash, what exactly is Sukuna's win condition? Especially when we later see Maki react to the world-cutting slash. So you are telling me Maki can dodge it, but the man with the sixth eyes can't perceive it? That doesn't make sense unless Gojo lowered his guard, which actually would fit the story, because Gojo letting his guard down has been established multiple times. Against Toji, against Kenjaku, and ultimately against Sukuna. That framing works perfectly. It's tragic, it's human, it's consistent. So why abandon that? Why turn the moment into Gojo glazing Sukuna instead? What makes this even more frustrating is that Gege later confirmed Gojo lost because he let his guard down, which means the narrative already had the perfect explanation. Gojo was exhausted, he thought he won, he relaxed for a split second, and Sukuna capitalized. That is completely believable. It doesn't diminish Sukuna's intelligence, it doesn't diminish his danger, and it doesn't destroy Gojo's character in the process. But instead of letting Gojo reflect on that mistake, Gege made him sound like Sukuna's #1 fan. The tragedy of Gojo was never supposed to be that he finally found someone strong enough to entertain him. The tragedy was that despite being the strongest, he could never save everyone. That's his character, that's his burden. Gojo didn't become a teacher because he wanted stronger opponents. He became a teacher because he wanted a better future. That's why people connected with him. So when his final major character moment becomes centered around praising Sukuna, instead of reflecting on his students, his failures, or the future he wanted to create, it feels hollow. Not because Sukuna isn't strong, but because Gojo deserved a conclusion that actually sounded like Gojo.